Welcome to the City Club of Eugene's February 12th, 2021 program, Delivering on the American Dream, the Promise of Affordability. This is the 20th program of our 2020-2021 programming year. My name is Scott Coltrane, and I'm the City Club President. Support for the City Club is provided by our members and sponsors. You can become a member of the City Club at our website, cityclubofeugene.org. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page, and are broadcast on public radio station KLCC 89.7 on Mondays at 7 p.m. We have both business and in-kind sponsors, including our diamond sponsors, Kaiser Permanente, University of Oregon, Peace Health, and Lane Community College, as well as generous support from the City of Eugene and from Lane County. This program is the second in a three-part series on local housing issues. In today's program, presenters will focus on housing affordability. We will be joined by Jeff Albanese, Ann Fifield, and Dylan Lamar. Biographical information on our speakers is available on our website, cityclubofeugene.org. I would like to thank Karin Knutson and John Belcher for coordinating today's program. In 2019, Oregon's legislature took the historic step to re-legalize traditional missing middle housing. But the work to build housing diversity and more inclusive neighborhoods has just begun. One promise of missing middle housing is that it can deliver affordability by design, that per unit development costs can come down when we design more efficient housing units and share land costs among multiple homes. In Portland, where the city's missing middle housing implementation was ahead of Oregon's new state law, some community members raised the objection that affordability was not guaranteed by the policy changes. In response, housing advocates crafted Portland's deeper affordability code amendments, an affordable housing density bonus equivalent to a $150,000 subsidy to each project. It turns out that accomplishing affordability is about doing the math and creating a path. There is also more than one path to affordability and housing stability, and Eugene needs several to serve its workforce, middle and lower incomes, and changing household demographics. Cooperative ownership structures, community land trusts, development incentives, and design innovation all have a role to play. Speakers today include Dylan Lamar of the local design development firm Cultivate, Jeff Albanese of Square One Villages, and Ann Fifield from the City of Eugene. They will address housing development strategies, innovative land development, and shared ownership structures, and design development approaches that have the potential to deliver increased affordability and create new paths to long-term housing stability. Our format today includes a question and answer period with City Club members via Zoom.
Okay, I'm Dylan Lamar. I'm a local architect and developer, and I'll be talking about expanding housing opportunity in Eugene. My background is as an architect of sustainable housing up in Portland, and I did a couple of really nice net zero energy pocket neighborhoods in my time up in Portland, and these were really lovely, beautiful, deeply sustainable projects. But unfortunately, they were very unaffordable. And as I began working as an architect developer down here in Eugene, I really wanted to find a way to bring sustainability to a more affordable price point, which I think is really imperative if we're truly going to achieve societal sustainability. I love old neighborhoods. And developers used to develop very diverse neighborhoods. And I've spent a lot of time over the last few years trying to figure out how to do that again. We used to develop neighborhoods with large single-family houses, but also large duplexes and quadplexes, small apartment buildings, small courtyard clusters. And you can see all these still in our historic neighborhoods and in communities across America. Unfortunately, in the 50s, zoning regulations, low density zoning regulations, what we call R1 here in Eugene, came in, and they were really very exclusionary by design. They very intentionally segregated our society and our housing based on socioeconomic lines between single family housing for the well-to-do and apartments for the rest. And over the years, over the decades, that's really taken a toll on our neighborhoods. And it's taken a toll on who's being served by our residential areas, by our neighborhoods, who's being served by the status quo, and who's being priced out of home ownership, most importantly. Increasingly, that's in addition to lower income folks, it's also middle income folks, millennials, people of color, smaller households and downsizers who are no longer able to find the housing that's the right size for them. So just increasing year by year, an increasing number of people, Eugenians, are priced out of the housing they want and need. So how do we enable developers to deliver not only affordable housing, but also affordable home ownership? Because I think that's tremendously important. Developers, it's important to understand how developers operate. They pursue the highest and best use of a property. And commonly we understand that to mean what yields the highest financial return. But that's not all. We also deliver what people want and what they can finance, importantly. But really importantly, when it comes to residential zoning, residential housing development, developers deliver what zoning allows. And with residential housing, that's very restrictive. The highest and best use of current R1 zoning is to build the biggest, most expensive house you can and sell it to the highest bidder. It's quite common in Portland over the last decade to see more and more old 1950s houses, cute little 2 bedrooms, get demolished in order to build McMansions, 3 stories, 4,000 square feet or more. And it's all luxury housing, and it's all pricing out diversity, economic diversity with our neighborhoods in favor of just the very wealthy. HB 2001, this missing middle housing regulation, would re-legalize housing diversity. It would allow, within the same built volume of that McMansion, for a duplex or a quadplex to be developed. It's going to regulate the intensity of the size of buildings rather than the number of units. And that allows us to start building smaller housing units that better match current household sizes. It will begin to re-legalize some of the historic housing diversity we've seen, the duplexes and quadplexes, the little cute courtyard apartments. Housing that we know and love will again be allowed to exist and to be developed anew again. From the research done up in Portland, we've seen that these more smaller units will lead to lower housing costs. So if we take, for example, a single family house in disrepair, under a business as usual scenario, that would get either renovated or demolished and turned into a McMansion, and it would be affordable in either case only to very high income earners. On the other hand, when we're allowed to break that house up into 2, 3, or 4 units, we can start to spread the cost of the development across more units and achieve affordability by a wider swath of our citizens. So upper middle income affordability is now achieved. People like teachers, firefighters, nurses, again, can afford housing in their neighborhoods. And that's great. That's starting to turn the tide of increasing exclusivity, which is the trend we're currently on, toward increasing inclusivity. But again, it's not the silver bullet be all end all, because there's still the other half of the population that's being priced out. And this is where we need what we call a deeper affordability opportunity. A deeper affordability principle allows for a density bonus for more affordable housing. It's like a free subsidy for affordable housing, while it also increases the city's property tax base. And the way it works is quite simple. We allow more units to be developed if you build to a affordable housing standard. If you're able to bring enough subsidy to the table that achieves deep affordability to truly low middle income earners. In Portland, they've also allowed you to slightly increase the bulk of what you build if you do an additional unit, so up to an 8-plex. Rather than a single family house, now we have 8 very small units, and we can achieve much deeper affordability through this kind of density bonus. And it doesn't cost us a thing. That's great, but what about homeownership? As we increase the number of housing units on a property, the property value also increases. And so if that property is only owned by a single individual, then access to ownership is actually even worse than it was before. You're really only going to have wealthy landowners that will now own property in our neighborhoods. By allowing shared ownership, we'll continue to see we'll continue to see a widening inequity between wealthy landowners and renters struggling to keep up unless we provide for shared ownership. Historically, we've seen 2 shared ownership pathways common in America. One is condominiums, which we're more familiar with. Condominiums are great, but they really only work for luxury housing or very large developments due to the development and insurance costs involved. Housing cooperatives are another pathway. These are a proven low-cost pathway to shared ownership that have a long history of supporting affordable housing, and it supports equity among shareholders who will manage their property democratically. Unfortunately, Oregon currently lacks regulations to enable financing of co-ops, and this is a big hurdle that I think is really important for us to overcome. So let me talk a little bit about the C Street Co-op. This is a property I'm developing right now in Springfield. We're about halfway through constructions. And what we're building here is a shared 4-bedroom house and a shared backyard house that will deliver 6 households with permanently affordable homeownership. There'll be cost sharing through a shared housing design, 6 1-bedroom suites. So we've designed, shared housing is a common way that you find affordable housing, right? A lot of us did this in college. What we did here is basically intentionally design the house to be shared, and we've provided every bedroom with its own private living suite. That's one way we kind of cut through the cost barrier of housing. The other one is I partnered with Square One Villages, and Square One Villages is able to bring some subsidy to the table through foundation grants mostly, that's allowing them to own the land as a land trust and establish a housing cooperative that each of these households will be an owner of. They'll be a co-op homeowner. The shared house up front, it's toward the front of the lot. Like I said, 4 1-bedroom suites. And in the back, we have a two 1-bedroom suite backyard house. We still have room for trees. We have room for gardens, a rain garden. And it's gonna be a very lovely property. To talk just a little bit about the development structure, because HB 2001 is not yet in effect, and because co-ops aren't fully enabled in Oregon, we had to jump through a lot of hurdles on this project that I'm hoping we don't have to jump through in the future. One of which is finding a construction loan. Most banks won't provide you with money to build a housing cooperative. So in this case, we partnered with a few local private social investors who were willing to loan their money at a below market rate in order to build this. And Square One, like I said, is bringing community grants to the table to help subsidize the land cost and organizing the co-op landowners. And Jeff will be talking about that a little more just in a second here. So I want to leave you then with just these 3 key takeaways. Housing developers right now are severely limited by zoning codes when it comes to residential housing development. To enable more affordable and right-sized housing, we need to enable more housing units to be built on these properties. We need to do that by supporting a deeper affordability density bonus. This will allow our neighborhoods to become much more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And we need to support Oregon in enacting better housing cooperative legislation. Shared ownership will allow homeownership opportunities to actually increase and for residents to continue to hold an equity stake in their neighborhoods. And I think that's extremely important, as does my colleague Jeff, who I'm going to pass it over to now. Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan. So my name is Jeff Albanese, and I'm the program director for Square One Villages. And we're an organization that got started identifying a serious need for shelter for adults experiencing homelessness in the Eugene, Springfield area. And our first project, which grew out of some grassroots organizing back in 2012 and 2013, was an alternative shelter project called Opportunity Village Eugene. And Opportunity Village is a tiny house village composed of 30 kind of rudimentary shelter, basic cabins for adults experiencing homelessness, along with some shared common amenities such as bathroom and food preparation area, a 30-foot yurt. And during our first year of operating Opportunity Village, the project was always intended to be a place where adults experiencing homelessness would have a safe and stable place to be while they were working on trying to get into more stable housing situation. And what we realized was there really just was not remotely enough affordable housing in the community for the households that we were serving at Opportunity Village. And so we decided to see if we could do something about it, and got into developing actual housing. And our first housing project is the Emerald Village Eugene Housing Cooperative, which is located in the Whitaker neighborhood of Eugene. And one of the values of our organization in developing Opportunity Village was we really wanted residents to take the lead in the management of the property that they were living in and sharing. And when we wanted to try and figure out a way to translate that into a housing project with Emerald Village, we identified cooperative housing as a model that really involves the occupants of a multifamily housing project taking the lead and being in charge of the management of the housing that they live in, from the everyday to the longer term. And so our affordability strategy, kind of the way that we were going to be able to develop housing that was going to be affordable to those folks that we were serving in Opportunity Village who just really didn't have many options that were affordable to them in the community. The model that we struck on is a shared equity model of home ownership. Shared equity meaning that the various ownership rights in the housing is distributed among a bunch of different stakeholders. And the specific shared equity model that we're using with our cooperative projects, such as the C Street project that we're working with Cultivate and with Dylan on in Springfield, combines elements of a limited equity cooperative and a community land trust. And those are two shared equity home ownership models that exist independent of one another. And community land trusts divide the ownership of land from the ownership of the house that sits on a piece of property. And in conventional community land trust housing, the housing itself is oftentimes just indistinguishable from any other kind of single family home. But the occupant of the home, the household that lives in the home, owns just the house that they live in. And the land is owned by an organization called a community land trust. So the ownership of the land is held by a land trust whose purpose is to make sure that the home remains affordable in perpetuity. And it achieves that through different kinds of resale restrictions on the homeowner. Typically, this is typically the price that a homeowner can sell their home is determined by a formula that's a part of a ground lease agreement between the homeowner and the land trust that owns the land. And the value of the home that the homeowner can sell it for appreciates according to a formula. So that's controlling price growth in the home, which is really driven by market conditions and bank lending patterns. So that's community land trusts, conventional community land trusts. Limited equity cooperatives are similar in that the resale value of the housing is also determined by a formula, which in the case of a limited equity cooperative is determined within the bylaws of the cooperative. And instead of, and these are multifamily developments like an apartment building or like a village of detached small cottages like our project with Emerald Village. Each household does not own necessarily the particular housing unit that they occupy. Instead, they own a share, an equal share with all the other members of the cooperative in all of the housing stock that's under the cooperative's control. And cooperatives are a form of corporation in which each member or shareholder has an equal equity stake in the enterprise, which in a housing cooperative is ownership of housing. And the board of the cooperative, which is democratically elected by the members, are primarily responsible for the management of the property as multifamily housing. So these are two separate shared equity models of housing that, you know, are tried and true. They exist throughout the country. And we've combined them in a way that complements some of the drawbacks with each of those forms of shared equity homeownership on its own. So a major limitation in conventional community land trust housing is that an individual household still needs to be able to qualify for a mortgage for the home that they're purchasing. And for the low income and extremely low income households that we're serving, that's not something that's really within reach realistically. It'd be very difficult for those households to be able to qualify for a home loan in a way that other households with a higher income wouldn't have too much of an issue with. And a limited equity cooperative addresses that drawback of community land trust housing because instead of an individual homeowner having to qualify for a mortgage, the cooperative itself, a cooperative corporation, is able to hold any permanent debt on the property. And that addresses some of the issues with individual households being able to qualify for a home loan. Some of the drawbacks of a limited equity cooperative existing on its own is that the members of a cooperative, particularly if a real estate market has gone up in value, the members of a cooperative can vote to change their bylaws and convert to a market rate cooperative in which the individual homeowners, when they decide to sell their share in the cooperative and the occupancy rights that they have, they can sell it to the highest bidder that they can find. And this is something that happened with a lot of housing cooperatives in New York City that were originally developed with resources from municipal government as limited equity cooperatives to provide affordable housing. After the affordability controls had expired, a lot of the members of those cooperatives realized that they could all make a whole lot of money if they converted to market rate co-op. And so combining a limited equity co-op with a community land trust and dividing the ownership of the land from the buildings and improvements that the cooperative owns can prevent that kind of market rate conversion from happening, because the limited equity cooperative is in a long-term ground lease relationship with an entity like Square One Villages, which is serving like a community land trust in that we are retaining ownership of the land in perpetuity for the purposes of affordable housing. So that's kind of the affordability strategy that that we've hit on with our projects in an effort to create permanently affordable housing that we think is really a no-brainer, and that we think a lot of more public investment should be going into, precisely because it can guarantee permanent affordability. Some of the other challenges that we're encountering with developing housing like this, Dylan mentioned, a big one is financing. And because shared equity homeownership is not really the norm in this country, the housing market is typically divided between conventional rental housing and conventional single-family homeownership. There are challenges with underwriting and finding lenders who are willing and able to make loans to shared equity projects, largely because it's just different than what they're used to. Historically, housing cooperatives, for example, including limited equity cooperatives, loans to housing cooperatives in this country have performed at way lower default rates than either mortgages made to single-family homeowners or to conventional rental investors. And we think that it's, right now is a good time to kind of revisit some of these shared equity strategies for achieving affordability. Thanks.
All right, I'm Ann Fifield. I'm the Economic Strategies Manager at the City of Eugene, and I've been part of an effort at the city over the last couple of years on a project that addresses housing affordability. And as you all have been listening for the last couple of weeks on the City Club, it's clear housing affordability and availability, it's a long-standing and growing problem in Eugene. One metric that policy wonks likes to use, like in the housing world like to use, is housing cost burden. A household is housing cost burdened when it spends more than 30% of its income on housing. In 2018, we conducted an analysis of housing costs and affordability, and that analysis found that 58% of Eugene's renter households are rent cost burdened, and 35% of our owner households are mortgage cost burdened. Since that analysis was conducted, there's been a pandemic that has hit some households very hard. Their incomes have significantly decreased, and we've seen housing prices increase. So the portion of the community that is housing cost burdened has undoubtedly increased. So the City of Eugene plays an important role to address housing affordability. Let's see, we have a team of people that focuses on building affordable housing for low-income households. This team manages federal funds to create new housing that's focused on providing housing for households at the lower end of the income spectrum. They work with affordable housing providers like St. Vincent de Paul, Cornerstone Housing, Homes for Good, and others to create housing for households that have incomes at or below 80% of our area median income. The city is also responsible for our land use code. It literally draws the plan for how our community is built. The land use code segregates residential, commercial, and industrial uses, and it's a big driver of what kind of building gets built where. It's not the only driver. Market demand also plays a really, really big role, but the city creates the entitlements for land, which entitle a property owner to use their land in a way deemed compatible with surrounding property. The city also provides essential infrastructure. A parcel of land that has no road access, no water service or sewer service isn't a very useful piece of land. The city and EWEB bring essential infrastructure to private property, making that property developable. The city and EWEB are also on the hook to maintain that infrastructure. Potholes need to be filled. So in 2018, the Eugene City Council directed its staff to identify tools and strategies that are available to the city to address housing affordability, availability, and diversity. And a group of staff implemented a project that we called Housing Tools and Strategies. The project included a lot of stakeholder outreach and technical analysis. And in that process, we identified over 80 individual actions that could be implemented by the city to increase affordability, availability, and diversity of housing in Eugene. The different actions fell into 4 very broad categories. 1, increase the supply of affordable housing. That is income qualified housing for very low income households. The second category was remove barriers to the land use code. The third was reduce the cost and time of construction. And then the fourth category we called additional options, which were items that didn't fit neatly into the first 3 categories. So we've done work to address housing, increase the supply of affordable housing, the income qualified housing for low income households. That's the federal resources that drive the production of that new affordable housing development. It has gotten smaller over time, but the need has grown. And so after this Housing Tools and Strategies project, the city established a local tax to generate revenue to support the construction of new housing for low income households. The Construction Excise Tax is a tax on the value of new construction. The funds go to the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. It's brand new. This fiscal year that we're currently in is the first year that the city will allocate these funds. And it's up to City Council to decide where those funds will go. And its intent is to increase that supply of affordable housing. We've also done work to remove barriers to the land use code. In response to the recent state legislation, the city's removed a number of barriers. When things that have already gone through and are part of the code now are, we now allow accessory dwelling units, commonly known as granny flats or mother-in-law units. Accessory dwelling units are also, we refer to them as ADUs, accessory dwelling unit. It is one housing type that can be built for a lower cost than a new single-family detached home. A homeowner can convert a garage or an attic to an extra unit, or a homeowner can build a small unit in the backyard. The costs can vary widely, but it's one tool to increase the supply of small units that can provide housing for a family member or be rented out to anyone. In response to state law, the city's changed its land use code to allow more ADUs. They are now allowed in all residential zones where single-family dwellings are allowed. And also, the city no longer requires on-site parking. For some lots, creating a new parking space added a lot of cost and has likely limited some property owners from building an ADU. That requirement has been eliminated. We can also no longer require owner occupancy in one of the units. Last week on City Club, Terry Harding, a land use planner at the City of Eugene, talked about middle housing, duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, cottage clusters. In response to state law, the city will be changing its land use code to allow these housing types. These changes to the code that allow ADUs and middle housing will allow Eugenians to construct smaller units all over town. By simply allowing these housing types in all residential areas, we will see more of these units come out of the ground. They tend to cost less than new single-family detached housing, which means they'll be more affordable to more households. They also cost less to maintain. Repainting an 800 square foot house costs a lot less than repainting a 2,000 square foot house. So it has long-term affordability built into it, that affordable by design idea. The city's also worked to reduce the cost and time of construction. However, there is no single thing the city can do to reduce the cost of construction. The great majority of costs are the materials to build the unit, lumber and drywall. But we are continuing to minimize regulatory costs. For example, the city charges systems development charges. Those are fees that we charge to fund new infrastructure like roads and wastewater treatment, parks and water. And when the city, a couple of years ago, the city updated its transportation system development charge methodology. And with that update, we explicitly waived the transportation SDC for ADUs, to throw a lot of acronyms at you. And so now if you build an ADU, there is no transportation SDC associated with it. We're in the process of updating our parks SDC, and the new one will go on the books in a couple of years. The new SDC for ADUs will actually decline. So if you build an ADU today, you'll pay an SDC for parks. In a couple of years, that will actually be lower than what it is today. Also, EWEB has lowered its water SDC for small units explicitly as part of this effort to lower cost of construction. Creating the opportunity for these smaller housing units makes a lot of sense for Eugene. In that analysis that we did as part of Housing Tools and Strategies, a bunch of data on demographics were part of the project, and that data showed that 1/3 of Eugene's households are single-person households. Only 1/4 of Eugene's households have children, but 55% of our housing units are single-family detached. The opportunity for a retired couple to downsize from a mid-sized home where they maybe raised children to something that's easier to maintain, so they have an opportunity to age in place in an easy to maintain home. There's not very many options for those aging households. It's also hard for younger households to find a starter home, something small that they can gradually build equity in. Middle housing will expand these opportunities. By being affordable by design, there will be more of these smaller homes that will create supply, that make home ownership a possibility for younger individuals and give older households an opportunity to downsize. And I think that wraps up what I wanted to say. And so I'll hand it back to you, Karen.
Thank you to all of our speakers today. So we'll now begin the moderated Q&A portion of our City Club program with questions coming from City Club members. And our first questioner today is John Belcher.
Thank you, Corin, and thanks to each of you for your very useful presentations today. Those who have already provided their thoughts to the implementation of House Bill 2001 here in Eugene commonly have the same concern that middle housing provide that housing affordability issue you brought up, especially given that potential that new middle housing will displace the lower priced existing housing with more expensive housing, as Dylan mentioned. And it's encouraging to hear the options you presented to answer that concern, but I'm going to ask you to go a little further. From all the information you presented today and what you know about this subject, please suggest 2 or 3 new outside the city's existing toolbox policies and or incentives you would propose Eugene specifically pursue to make that middle housing more affordable and ownable by our residents.
Start with Anne.
Outside of the existing toolbox, let's see. I don't have a very good answer off the top of my head. I would like to see, there is an issue around condo development and insurance liability that is a relatively new law in Oregon that's increased liability costs for condos since 2008. And it's definitely diminished the financial feasibility of condo development in Eugene. I would love to see that righted so that it wasn't so much of a burden, so that it was limiting that kind of development. I'd like to see that at the state level, outside of our toolbox.
And Dylan and Jeff.
Yeah, I think 2001 is a great start. It's going to start, like I said, to reverse the trend from exclusivity toward inclusivity by allowing more smaller units to get built finally. But as we've seen, it doesn't go far enough. When you look at the numbers for how what price point we can deliver housing with the new HB 2000 law, HB 2001 regulations, it still doesn't achieve deep affordability. It does achieve better affordability than the current zoning does, but it doesn't go far enough to truly serve the full spectrum of our community. So that's where we need this, quote, deeper affordability option, which allows housing developers who want to deliver deeply affordable housing and generate some subsidies to do that. It gives them a density bonus that allows them to do 1 or 2 more units, maybe build a little bit larger units so that we can serve a wider spectrum of our community. And again, it does that without any cost to anyone. It's a free subsidy. And I think it's just absolutely critical, as we've seen from Portland's residential infill process. It's really critical to achieve deep affordability.
Yeah, and I think that the bill has, is one useful tool. I guess one thing that I would say, and that I think some of the shared equity models that we're using to promote permanent affordability is, in the absence of resale restrictions, there's nothing that can necessarily control the growth in the resale price in the future of any housing developed, even if it's subsidized initially with these density bonuses. And that's why, I think that being able to be more flexible with some of the, with public subsidies for shared equity homeownership that's distributing ownership rights across multiple stakeholder groups in order to achieve permanent affordability into the future. I think that that's something that is worth looking more into, because currently existing public programs, whether state, federal, or local, they're also working within this binary between single family homeownership and investor-owned rental properties.
Okay, and our next question today is from Joel Corin.
I'm Joel Corin, City Club member since 2012, and I'd like to ask the speakers what, in each of their opinions, are the 3 toughest hurdles to overcome to build affordable housing in Eugene. Thank you.
Dylan, will you kick us off on this one?
Sure. Material and labor costs and land costs have all gone up dramatically over the last few decades. All of those are only going to continue to go up. So really it's a question of how can we share those costs among the most amount of people? And that is exactly the equation that makes affordable housing when it comes to our current zoning. So right now, we're allowed to do 1 house and 1 mini house, 1 ADU in the backyard, which is currently severely limited in how large it can be. So let's say we've spread the across 1.5 units. But with HB 2001, if we're allowed to now develop a quadplex, we can spread the cost across 4 true units. That will achieve, dramatically cut the cost. We still need to go further if we want to see ownership opportunities extended to a wider diversity of our population. And I think we should, and that's where housing co-ops, I think, become really important. That wasn't 3, but I lost count.
Anne or Jeff, any to add to that list?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, yeah, no, I think the one that Dylan mentioned is the cost of land. When you have a market for, nobody's producing any more land. So that market pressures just inflate land prices. The second is the cost of money, meaning financing. There are a lot of dynamics that lead to inflation in financing, including just overall economic inequality. which is, one of the things that we've seen is that it's not the case that there's no profit that's possible in developing affordable, even deeply affordable housing. It's just not as profitable. It's not the highest and best use when seen through the lens of the greatest possible financial return. And part of that has to do with just overall economic inequality. And then, yeah, the last I would say is just the whether you're talking about single family homeownership or investor owned rental properties, each of those kinds of owners is, when they want to sell housing in the future, they can sell it to wherever they can get the most money from. And due to bank lending patterns and stuff like that, I mean, that leads to a lot of inflation when there's, in the absence of any kind of regulation to keep the growth of prices, a little bit more under control.
I think neighborhood resistance to change has been a really, really big hurdle in Eugene. We've seen neighbors fight new development, even when, and then take it to, there's lawsuits involved. The new development can prevail, but sometimes what they've done by adding that resistance to it, it's added time to the development process, and time equals money. And some projects have been killed. They should legally have the right to do it, but the difficulty in counteracting the neighborhood resistance, basically they decided to stop the project. And I think the changes to the land use code will help minimize that, but it will still be there. And change happens to neighborhoods. And so the land use code should ideally allow incremental change that is compatible with the existing neighborhood. A lot of folks talk about the cost of land is an issue. And the first place a lot of folks go is, well, we just need to expand the urban growth boundary. That's a double-edged sword. If you expand the urban growth boundary, that comes with a lot of costs associated with it that the community is on the hook to maintain forever. That means new roads, new sewer lines, new water lines. Those things are not cheap to maintain. And our property tax system will make it difficult to maintain those in the long term. And so expanding the urban growth boundary is not a panacea, especially if you need to think about fiscal sustainability, which all local governments should be thinking about fiscal sustainability. Can you generate enough revenue from that new tax base to cover the maintenance of the road when it needs to be replaced in 30 years? So that's, it's a much more complicated solution than just expanding land supply. I think things like middle housing, where you incrementally add new housing to your existing landscape, is one way to, it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve the problem, but it addresses the problem. It moves you forward in the right direction to some degree.
And our next question comes from City Club member Katie.
So my question is from your avid listeners, and they want to know, how many units of affordable housing do we need today to catch up with the present need, if you can say that? And how many units per year will we need once we caught up, should we ever be able to do that? So those are the questions that I'm posing on behalf of other folks.
Anne, do you have those statistics to share with us?
I know staff, my colleagues have been working to answer that question, and I do not have the answer to that question at my fingertips.
So do anybody get that answer? No?
Yeah.
I can,
go ahead, Jeff. I was going to say, yeah, Jeff or Dylan.
I don't know I know that Eugene City staff, that they do a great job working on kind of modeling that. All that I would want to say is that I don't think it's simply a supply of housing units problem, and mentioned the kind of imbalance between what the demographic reality is of how big households are locally versus like what the existing housing stock is. But also, there are a lot, this varies from market to market, but it's not simply a supply of housing units question. I mean, I think that that's a big part of it, but there are a lot of new housing development isn't necessarily intended to ever be occupied by like a permanent resident, just because of some of the economic disparities and distortions that overall economic inequality, that are impacting how the development process and the real estate market work.
One quick thing I'd add is like Jeff said, it's not just about the number of units, it's also about the type of unit. So for example, a one bedroom or small two bedroom that can be owned is much more valuable in my eyes to our society as a whole than a one bedroom or two bedroom apartment, because we're allowing a local resident individual to have an ownership equity stake in their neighborhood, to gain appreciation value, that kind of thing. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Our next question comes from Mary Layton.
Yes, I also have a question from a non-member. Are there any financial or economic tools that you can imagine that would lubricate the construction of large numbers of affordable housing? You've talked about this a little bit already, I think.
Go ahead, Dylan, and then Jeff, you're nodding your head.
In my mind, again, coming from the perspective of a small-time developer that's trying to figure out how to solve or find a solution to this problem, is housing cooperatives. It is a historically proven way to deliver affordable housing, and for some unknown reason, they're not enabled in Oregon, and we've really had our hand behind our back. And as I see HB 2001 coming down the line, and I think about our neighborhoods starting to grow and finally deliver some more housing units, it really makes me, it would be so tragic if all we delivered were rental units. Because as we know, renters are not secure in their housing position. Rents go up year after year as housing gets more and more in demand, and people get displaced, and it's a game of musical chairs, and some get priced out the bottom and they're sleeping in their cars. So it's really important that ownership opportunities be created here so that you can get a fixed monthly housing cost through your mortgage, and perhaps also some appreciation value, unless we're doing like a shared equity model. Even still there, you do gain some appreciation value. So.
Yeah, Dylan mentioned, challenges in Oregon for financing cooperative development, and I don't think that it's not only in Oregon. It's mortgage lenders. Most mortgage lenders don't want to hold the loan that they make. They want to sell that debt to the securities market, and in order to do that, the loan has to be a conforming loan. It has to meet certain conditions to be standardized to be able to be sold to the securities market. And the securities market currently, they're in this binary where the only possible way to standardize those loans is whether it's for a single family homeowner or an investor owned rental property. There has been some progress made on this for community land trust, like conventional community land trust housing, where some securities markets are able to help lenders be able to make those loans. So yeah, that's one challenge that for financing. The other big one, I guess, and I mean, I don't know if this is kind of a cop-out because it's just sort of it's just kind of a general thing, but just patient capital and sources of patient capital. Like, it is not the case that there can't be any return on an investment in affordable housing. It's just that the return might not be as quick or as great as a different use of the same capital investment could be made. And there are a lot of, I think local and state government, and of course the federal government, but even local and state governments, like, they can do interesting thing because they're governments. They're able to be patient capital if they want to be. And an example of that are some of the ways that other states have used their affordable housing trust funds, such as Washington State, they were able to provide financing for limited equity cooperative, for limited equity cooperatives by, just being able to provide long-term, extremely low interest loans. And that's a tool that is something that's capable, that governments are capable of doing.
And I'll add to that, at the C Street project, we were able to find local private social investors who were loaning, we're promising them a 6% return on their investment over a 10-year investment period. So that's not that patient. That's still a pretty good return when the investment is right down the street from you. You know the people involved. There's inherent level of trust that can be there. And so I'm hoping to explore that further.
And I'll toss in on the financial side that the city can offer doesn't have to do with the financial markets. One tool we have for multifamily housing is the MUPTI, the multi-unit property tax exemption, a tax exemption, new value up to 10 years. That's an expandable program. It could be expanded geographically. It could go towards not just big multifamily developments. That what the city gets out of it is it encourages new housing development. The property tax exemption lowers the operating costs for new rental it works for ownership and rental, but that operating costs in those first few years, but in the long term, it's new development that increases the assessed value of the city overall. And I've talked to folks that some projects weren't built earlier because the MUPTI didn't apply to them. And so it's a tool the city could have brought in if it decided that were a priority. And the other big cost that the city imposes are system development charges. And there's ways for us, there's policy decisions that can be made. We waive SDCs for affordable housing complexes. When we build something in partnership with Homes for Good or St. Vincent de Paul, we have a program to waive, we don't waive SDCs, we pay for them in a different way, but it's something that the city has control over. It's our money flow. We don't get the revenue to support the construction of new infrastructure, so it comes with a cost.
Plenty more for us still to think about, but we've reached the end of our program for today for our City Club members and KLCC listening audience. Thank you to our speakers, Dylan Lamar of Cultivate, Jeff Albanese from Square One Villages, and Ann Fifield from the City of Eugene, talking about housing affordability in the 21st century.
This has been our February 12th, 2021 program, Delivering on the American Dream, the Promise of Affordability. Before we proceed, I'd like to recognize our diamond sponsors. Kaiser Permanente exists to provide high-quality, affordable healthcare services and to improve the health of our members and the communities we serve. More information at www.kp.org. Support comes from the University of Oregon. Since 1876, UO has helped Oregonians question critically, think logically, reason effectively, communicate clearly, act creatively, and live ethically. More information at uoregon.edu. Peace Health is proud to serve Eugene, Lane County, and beyond. As your hometown healthcare partner for more than 80 years, our mission is to keep you and your family healthy. Learn more at peacehealth.org. Lane Community College transforms lives through learning. LCC provides comprehensive, accessible, high-quality educational opportunities that promote student success. For more information, visit lanecc.edu. I would also like to acknowledge our gold sponsors, Luash Cobb, Jerry Diethelm, architect, landscape architect, and AARP of Oregon. Before we thank our speakers today, I have a few quick announcements. Thank you to our in-kind sponsors, KRVM 91.9 Radio, PAC Info and Simplified Computing LLC, Dotson's Photography. And a special thank you to public radio station KLCC FM 89.7 for airing City Club programs on Mondays at 7 p.m. Our programs are always available on our YouTube channel and on our Facebook page. If you are a City Club member, you can ask a question at a future taping of our programs. If you're not yet a member, you can join and then participate. More information is on our website, cityclubofueugene.org. Next week, our program focuses on another housing issue: losing health and home, Oregon's pending COVID-19 eviction crisis. This program will be the third in a three-part series on local housing issues. More details and information about future programs can be found online at the City Club's website, cityclubofueugene.org. Now, I would like to thank today's speakers for a great program. Dylan Lamar, Jeff Albanese, and Ann Fifield, thank you very much. This concludes today's program. Be well and stay safe.